Now we are having Lucy Küng, because the person who was thought to be here couldn't make it to the stage now and to the DIS. So Lucy Küng, who's the author and research fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, will talk about common factors driving the most innovative digital news business in the world for the next 20 minutes. Is she already here? You're there? Okay, we get the tech fixed. Okay, thank you very much. And I really invite you to go on Panoply. I did it, and you can have this sponsorship experience, how they create the ads on various podcasts. Okay, we'll have lunch by 13. Let's say, maybe we take 5 minutes more of your time, so we'll go into lunch at 1:10 if you allow. And sorry for the tech, we work on that in the afternoon. Okay, very warm welcome on stage, Lucy Küng. Yeah, here you are. Thank you so much.
Shall I stand up here?
Yes, please.
Okay. Can we roll the presentation? I think there is one. How many of you were at the presentation this morning, the early one?
Okay. Already.
Good. Should we just, what I've done also, I loaded another set of slides, which actually has the New York Times, Guardian, Quartz on, which I didn't talk about before. I would like to make this really, really interactive, especially because I've jumped up here.
Good idea. Thank you very much.
Can you just throw your questions at me and we can turn this into a discussion? Is that all right with all of you?
From the very beginning, they are quite shy this morning. I tried it several times. It needs some time to warm up. So maybe you have a couple of things to say.
Okay,
and then
have we got a clicker? There was a clicker. Okay, if we just start with the... No.
Do we have a second clicker?
Yes. Give you a free copy of the book.
Grand, that sounds fantastic. I was listening this morning to the presentation about the guy from Vice.
Shane,
yes. Cool guy from Vice, and I really would love to work for him. He looks really cool. But the thing is, daily business for publishers is obviously time-consuming enough. What do you think is the likelihood, apart from buying and investing in these companies early stage, what do you think is the likelihood of a transition from, a real relevant pivot for a classic publishing company? Not just looks like, but actually is.
I think the pivot is so important, and I think it's something that classic media, and in fact, one of my passions, as well as trying to ensure that classic media share this growth. I mean, this is a massive new industry that has emerged, and classic media should be much stronger in it. Is actually to stop using the word legacy, all this stuff, which is faintly insulting, I think, but. If we look at what these new players are doing, they are tremendously agile. And it feels to me that what's happened a lot for traditional media is they've somehow got stuck in agile methodologies, and that's it. We are agile because we've implemented Scrum and whatever. But there is an issue around being able to pivot the organization. And this is actually something that even Facebook, it appears, can still pull off. And I think this is, one of the cultural imports that's needed from Silicon Valley. I'm not too much in favor of, taking everyone to Silicon Valley and then they have an epiphany and they come back and they're different. But I do think that, for me, and in fact, I've just got a new senior research fellowship at Oxford, and I'm going to look at the really unsexy nitty-gritty of how you get organizations to pivot. Because I think it's very, very hard, and I think the big challenge that is really, really difficult, and I understand why it's difficult, you have to be able to exit areas, which is, a really toxic message to give, but you need that luxury of focus. And the ideal is to somehow combine the luxury of focus you get with, maybe third stage funding startups who have a couple of really smart VCs on the board, with all of the assets from legacy status, the brand that means a lot to a lot of people, it's got emotional investment, serious readership, very committed individuals committed to creating great content. And that's the trick to pull off. The benefits from traditional assets with the agility of the startup, the focus of the startup. And I think you can't focus if you're too spread. So if you look at what's happened actually in broadcast media as well as print media, is we've just added on layers to the broadcasting system. It started off with the one product, then we went to niche products, then we went to the web and online, now we're going to social, mobile, and we're not taking anything away. And the net result of that is that resources are fantastically stretched. And the level of complexity means we're very constrained in the ability to which we can move. And I think there's a lot of hard work for leaders to be done in chipping away and simplifying and focusing, decluttering, actually.
And can I add to that question? That really means you need new staff often, instead of letting people evolve into a different thinking and doing?
Maybe. I think for me the critical issue is actually a really boring structural one. Where do you put the new operation? And I was at Harvard for a while when Christensen was there and doing a lot of work, and at the same time I was researching BBC News Online, which is really successful and sort of done from within the organization. And I used to disagree fundamentally with this idea that new units need to be autonomous. But what I've seen in the years since then is actually, I think they do need to be off the radar screen, not celebrated as the great digital future, because that's really annoys the rest of the organizations that's generating the revenues. But they've got to be allowed to experiment, to not have to do very extensive, detailed reporting about their plans, and obviously, they've got to run themselves in professional ways according to kind of principles of good governance, but they do need autonomy to flex and move with the market. And I think the way to do that is to put them off to one side. Don't celebrate them as, the next coming, but give them the ability to move and develop with the market. They may need new staff, but they will also need some senior staff who know how to navigate bureaucracy and resources. An awful lot of this stuff can fall because of sort of resource allocation principles inside the organization. There's a lot of really subtle stuff that can be hurdles, actually.
Two comments, and then I won't ask any more. One is, I've been coming to this event every year since the very first one in Hanover at CeBIT, when it was the 100 people in the room. And I have never once seen a feedback loop in this organization where it says, this is what we said was cool in 2009, and this is what happened to it. So I think as an industry, we kind of lack a certain amount of self-evaluation and critical thinking, because there's a lot of knowledge in the last 9 years of the booms and the busts, but we don't really speak about them. That's the first thing as an industry.
Yes.
And the other one is, I was looking last night at a video of Elon Musk talking about solar energy, and how the phrase he used was, we could have electric cars now, but for the fact that there's an unpriced externality that's slowing the process down. And I think as an industry, we have to evaluate that as well. Like, what's driving the fact that as classic publishers, we inherently slow ourselves down because we have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo for as long as possible. And this is a critical point to evaluate. Evaluate the things that we've tried with some relevant KPI analysis of what worked, what didn't. And also this question of, why aren't we moving faster? I mean, there are other reasons out there beyond digital first that we're not moving faster. There's a status quo in our mindset that's convenient to maintain this. And unless we actually identify that and address that, our lunch will always be eaten by the Shanes of the world. And why shouldn't it be? We're not competitive with ourselves.
I think there's 3 points I'd like to make there, if I can remember them, hold my head. First thing, I would completely agree. I think there's massive reservoirs of untapped creativity and innovation in media organizations and wisdom, and that is why, to some extent, I'm against trying to solve this with external consultants. I think the trick is liberating that energy. But a lot of that is then reframing. There's a really critical piece here about how you ask for innovation from the staff. And it's saying, okay, the content's great, but we need to actually focus on innovating our business model, reinventing this organization. But these are very smart people who really know the market. And what's really striking is in the current environment, the people lower down at the peripheries of the organization know far more about how markets are developing, how consumers are changing than people in the boardroom. So there needs to find ways, and things like Slack are great ways to liberate that energy. The second thing, which is, I think, one of my big controversial, provocative messages is, as an industry, we need to stop obsessing about the content, because where we are being beaten is in how we run our organizations. You look at these digital disruptors, they are so sharp as organizations, how they structure themselves, how they recruit, how they promote, how they compensate, how they integrate, how they motivate. And somehow there's this sort of anti-business, anti-managerial ethos that has taken root in the media, I think. And we've really got to get very sharp about that stuff as well, because frankly, the content innovation will happen. That's what people are there to do. You know, the media industry, if you can rely on one thing, is that they will create fantastic high-quality content. But sadly, their organizations are not. I mean, this is provocative, I know, but I feel they're not quite up to snuff. And I would love for them to get as sharp as the Facebooks and Googles of this world in terms of the Quartzes, in terms of how they run themselves. And part of that, a big part of that, is really unleashing this kind of untapped, latent, innovative capacity inside the organizations, actually, I think.
Do you want to go on or any further? No, now we get them, on the track. Yeah.
I'm from a sort of traditional magazine company that is now, or has transitioned to a digital.
It's classic now.
One of the biggest problems is engaging, or how do you engage the journalists in the revenue side, or accepting that they are part of the revenue generation system?
Yeah, that's part of a big cultural change, I think. And what, I don't know if you were at the presentation I did earlier, but one of the big findings, one of the kind of top line findings from this study, in a way that I think the real message was this integration of technology and journalism. But what you're actually seeing in the leading organizations like The Economist, like the FT, like Quartz, is New York Times, is actually commercial people are sitting there as well. And in fact, if you look at these digital startups, they're large offices with all these trestle tables, and there's, the commercial people here, the journalists here, and the tech people here. So I think actually they've got to physically be brought together. I think actually really low-tech job swaps, swap jobs for a week and try and understand the world from another perspective is really, really important. And I think also exposure to the young, to the companies where those obstacles, those kind of cultural hurdles have been removed, so that people can understand there are quality players out there who think differently.
Thank you.
Please. We have a second mic.
I'm Chris Llewellyn from FIP. Your first slide talked about successful digital news businesses. I see it's now innovative. And
yeah, it's hang on a sec. Yeah, I changed this because I changed the slide deck, so I had, in case people want to know anything about The Guardian or Quartz, that's why.
Well, that's actually my question, because given The Guardian's had a decade of losing between 30 and 50 million pounds, what's the definition of success?
Actually, there's a long rationale in the book, how significant digital audiences. I mean, the issue is, if you've come at this from legacy status, it's completely different if you come across it as a clean sheet. That's one thing. It's really different if you've got private equity or venture capital backing than if you've actually got legacy revenues. So essentially, that there are lots and lots of different criteria for success, but I think the core one I had was actually amount of traction in digital markets, the amount of resonance, and I mean, there's a set of criteria. I can actually send you the chapter if that's helpful. But I think the issue for The Guardian is, I think The Guardian is hitting a pivot now, actually, especially in response to ad blocking software. And I think we're going to see quite a significant change in their business model at the moment. But at the time I did this research, their monthly global uniques were bigger than New York Times, which is actually pretty significant from a UK liberal newspaper that is not really, I mean, it's a big player in the UK market, but one wouldn't expect it to be necessarily a dominant player in world markets, and they have expanded incredibly successfully to the US and Australia.
I'm Josh Rucci from Bloomberg. I was really interested to hear what you were talking about with BuzzFeed and their focus on data science and how it runs through everything they do. Hearing that layered with what Tori from VG was talking about with the mobile app in the pocket of all the journalists that they can evaluate how stories are performing on a day-in, hourly, minute-by-minute basis. Is what's happening at VG, based on your studies, is that table stakes the way you see it? Is that what sort of every publisher is doing? Or is that along the lines of the innovation that you saw at BuzzFeed? I'm just wondering how far BuzzFeed's gone down this road.
Actually, I can't answer that with detailed feedback. I would say, I mean, Schibsted is definitely a company I wanted to include in the research. The problem with the research actually was I used a lot of secondary data. I don't speak Norwegian. That was really a pragmatic reason I couldn't involve. But the other actually interesting thing I think about Schibsted, Axel Springer, and actually there's a lot of German people in the audience I think here would be interesting. My sense is if you have English language as a dominant market, you've got one big strategic option, which is you expand internationally. If you've got a minority language, I don't mean that in any disparaging sense, but you know, German or Norwegian or Swedish or Dutch or Danish, that option isn't open to you. So what you see in those companies, I think, is more innovation in terms of acquisitions, in terms of how they set up the organization and so on. So I think I would imagine Schibsted is leading the way in that dimension exactly the same way as BuzzFeed is leading the way. The other thing that I have seen, actually going back to my work with BBC News Online, is how powerful it is for journalists once they get that feedback. Because, you know, journalists, their internal motivation is they want their voice to be heard. They really want their voice to be heard. That's why they're in this business. And it's feedback that they personally respond to. And I think as soon as they start to get that kind of feedback loop coming in, then you start to find they self-correct. And this is part of my thesis. There's so much actually sort of intrinsic ability in terms of ability to respond to innovate in these organizations.
It's quite a granular question as well, but on your last column there, right, if you were to put data analyst, data scientist, whichever next to that, right? What would you think the ratio would be for something like BuzzFeed if they're 2-to-1 between journos and tech, or the other way around actually, 2-to-1 between tech and journos, right? Where would they be on data scientists?
I would think they've got double the number of data scientists to people doing content actually. Yeah, I mean, but the thing about these. You know, that's really a challenge, especially people like BuzzFeed and Vice, who are clearly, they've got owners who are looking for an exit at some point. There is so much hype in the coverage of these companies that it's very, very hard to try and filter down and find out what is actually going on. And this is really, it's a very crude metric, but it just began to fascinate me the more I went into this, that I began to realize there is actually a correlation here. And also, you know, talking to the successful organizations. And it does seem to be that the midterm point is that actually these two elements are synthesized in the actual content creators. And I think with the next generation, that's going to be much less of a problem. The people that have grown up with Snapchat are really going to get how to do content on Snapchat, how to cover the caucuses. Actually, the BBC did a fantastic Snapchat story on the US caucuses, which was really, really interesting to see, but I think it's coming.
Anybody else for the moment? No, I think we have a couple of maybe 2 minutes left. Besides what you already talked about, what do you think are the last 3 key findings you would like to share with us before leaving the room? Is there anything else you would like to drop?
What I would like to drop, hang on a sec, oh gosh, it's difficult. I think my core message firstly is really focus very hard on getting the organizations up to snuff, become more agile and really follow that through. I think there is what I think's happened a lot in the media industry, that they have been so bombarded by the pace of change, relentless pace of change. To some extent, they've sort of moved into a strategic vacuum, and all the energy that used to go into strategy has kind of gone into innovation, which is clearly important. But I think it is time to do some very clever strategic thinking about where is this industry, how is this industry going to position itself against the digital platforms? I mean, this is hyperscale, and so there is a huge challenge around how do you position yourself against that? And I think that's some very hard thinking that needs to be done, and I think, so really, the Quartz case is fascinating. Quartz is a really interesting example of it started from the Atlantic, so very, very old established organization, clean sheet startup from an established player, very, very smart strategy, really, really exquisitely executed. So it is possible, but you need some really, really hard, sharp, discriminating thinking in there. And I think that's what needs to happen.
Thank you very much for the good and the hard news. Thank you very much. Okay, and thank you so much for jumping in a second time today, which was not prospected.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you very much. Very much. Lucy Küng.